Okay, I started the recording and I will start in just a minute or two as we have more people come in. Montana, I bet, are you getting snow out there, Tabitha? Yeah, say we're supposed to be in the like low 60s tomorrow here and then rain Wednesday night, which as much as I never look forward to rain, particularly with dogs that like to go out and play in it, we really need it in Missouri. We're quite dry right now, and we're having some fire issues in places. So be glad to see the rain actually this week. Okay, I think I have everybody in for now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started today. Today we're going to talk about tree pruning. So right now is actually, we're not quite to the best time to prune. So we want to wait till the trees hit their dormancy. And we usually have just a little bit of still sap flowing as trees are going into dormancy. Okay, I think I got everybody admitted now. So this is a good time to start thinking about and planning for tree pruning. So we're going to go through kind of the how-tos. I also included some shrubs in this presentation, how to do that as well. But just a quick reminder before I get too far. So what is Women Owning Woodland? It's a program that's being developed to provide learning opportunities and support for women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. We organize field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared towards our women forest landowners and forest enthusiasts, because there's a lot to be said for understanding a lot about the woodlands, even if we don't own any of our own. It helps us be good stewards of public land as well. So also a Facebook page that provides networking opportunities and a place to come if you have any questions. So please feel free to use that anytime if you have questions concerning anything, you know, wildlife, forestry. It's a good place and a good resource. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Why do we prune trees? So one of them is to promote plant health. So by pruning them, we can kind of prepare them for perhaps things like ice storms or windstorms. We can kind of make them a little bit healthier. We can prune out dead or dying branches that can, again, promote kind of long-term plant health. All those reasons help that tree stay healthy as we go forward. Also maintain intended purposes, particularly for plants in a landscape. So we do occasionally prune trees that are considered like our woods trees, and we can do that to help increase the value of those trees. But for the most part, the trees and shrubs that we prune are the ones that are around our houses and are serving a particular purpose in landscape. And I should say that before we even go into pruning, if you're planting trees in the landscape, it's always good to have, we were saying, you know, right tree, right place. So understanding how tall and how large a tree or shrub can get can help us put the right tree or shrub in the right place for the landscape. However, pruning can also be a way for us to maintain those trees for the purposes that we have for them. So this oftentimes has a lot to do with size in particular. We can also prune to improve plant appearance. So this can, again, help by pruning so it doesn't look things like crossing branches or suckers that just aesthetically are not appealing to us. We can prune those to help increase the appearance of that plant. And then another one is to protect people and property. So a lot of times our trees and landscaping are going to be in places where people are interacting. We park cars, we have trees that are next to houses. So we can prune in order to protect people that would be underneath those trees or near those trees, and then property that potentially is in the same area as those trees. So pruning should start preferably the earlier the better. So we can start pruning and training our young trees and shrubs so that they grow the way that we want them. This also can encourage strong development. So we prune to shape our young trees. We don't cut the leader. So this is going to be the leader. It is that main branch that comes off. We want to encourage usually a strong leader just for appearance's sake. In some cases with fruit trees, there's a little bit different pruning methods, but for our like yard trees, landscaping trees, again, if you're thinking about forest trees, we want to maintain a good leader. When we do think about what we want to prune off, thinking about branches to remove. So usually our general rule of thumb is we don't want to remove more than 1/3 of the branches, because this is not going to leave enough leaves during the growing season for us to have a lot of photosynthesis and have a really good healthy tree. We want to prune it so it grows strong, but we don't want to prune so much that it doesn't have the resources it needs to stay healthy. So we 1/3. But there's some things that we can kind of look for that sometimes make it a little bit easier as we're thinking about pruning. Because it's like, oh, that's an obvious one, I can remove it, add that to my 1/3. Because sometimes looking at a tree, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure what I want to remove and what I want to keep. So thinking about some things like crossing branches. So if they cross back over each other, there's a good chance they can rub against each other, which can cause wounding, which can lead to some long-term problems and issues that we have. If it's a tree that we have in a yard that we intend to like mow under or walk under, removing the lower branches can help us raise that crown up a little bit so we can fit, like a riding mower underneath it, or we can walk under it. If we have, in particular, thinking about evergreen trees or trees where a single leader is desirable, but we have multiple leaders, removing those multiple leaders can, again, just make the appearance of that tree a lot better. I did Christmas tree management for a period of time, and we would go through those Scotch pine is what we raised, and we would go through, and some of them had multiple leaders, so we would always select a single leader to make that tree have a more desirable Christmas tree shape or appearance to it. Pruning young shrubs is not as critical as young trees, but we do use those same principles. So if we're planting deciduous shrubs, again, we don't often worry too much about the leader process here, picking a leader, because oftentimes our shrubs kind of, instead of coming to a point shape to them, they do spread out. But we do want to thin out branches that are crossing each other, thin out some for good spacing. If there's any broken, disease, or crossing circling roots or branches, we can prune those and start that training process. And then when we plant deciduous shrubs for hedges, you want to prune each plant to within 6 inches of the ground. So we don't, if we're using them for a hedge piece or as just a shrub, we keep them a little bit off the ground. So if you have branches that are so low that they're kind of drooping onto the ground, this is an area where insects from the soil, disease from the soil can actually kind of cause some issues for our branches. So we do kind of trim those up as well. And I'm sorry, this slide has a lot going on, but these are kind of the general pruning guidelines. So very first is removing any diseased, broken, or dead branches from your tree. So that's kind of right off the top what we want to remove. If you have any branches that are growing downward, so this would kind of have a weakened branch to it, so we can prune those off. If two limbs are crossed, entangled, or competing with each other, removing one of them at the base of the limb completely is going to be recommended. So again, if they are crossing each other or entangled with one another or growing even like really close where they're rubbing, when the wind blows, when the tree gets moved, those limbs that are touching or crossing each other, they're going to rub against each other, which is going to cause wounds on both of those branches. It also causes an opening for things like disease or insects to get in there. And the fewer wounds that we can have on a tree, the better. But again, these also are going to cause kind of scars for the long term. So by removing one, we can kind of take care of that. Remove any limbs that are along the trunk that are bigger in diameter than the trunk itself. If we're looking at the tree, so this is really looking at younger trees, but if we have any limbs that come off and they just kind of occasionally will grow this way, we'll have a limb that comes off that gets really large in size. If it's bigger than the diameter of the trunk, it is going to be so big that it's going to be hard for that trunk to support that limb, which can lead to breakage. So if we prune it off early, this is going to prevent a lot of long-term damage down the road. You can also remove suckers that are coming up from the roots or low on the trunk. So certain trees seem to be more prone to this. And I will say that occasionally, if we're looking at older trees, if we have suckers coming from the roots or like low on the trunk, this can be indicative of some kind of long-term health issues for a tree. So it might be that they like drought conditions are in place, or some other kind of health issues are going on. But we do want to remove those suckers because they take a lot of resources from the tree and they aren't very visually appealing to us, particularly in landscape. So they are some that we can remove right off the bat. We can also remove what we call vigorous or vertical branches. These are called water sprouts, and I'll show you some pictures of these as well. And I should say that these are also sometimes indicative of some larger health issues with a tree, but they can be removed, again, for the same reasons we remove suckers, is that they do kind of take resources from the rest of the tree, and they aren't very visually appealing to us, so we do remove those. When we do our pruning, we want to make sure we remove large limbs first, I skipped one. Making our pruning cuts first close to the branch collar, and I'll show you the correct way for us to cut off particularly larger branches so we don't create more damage for the tree than we already are by pruning. Because there's kind of a special way that we can remove those branches so that they will heal faster. We do want to remove large limbs first. So again, if we have some larger limbs that we need to remove for any of the above reasons we talked about, removing them first helps us get an idea for, again, that 1/3 that we don't want to go above for removal of branches, because we do want our tree to have plenty of resources for the next growing season. Thinning cuts that remove entire branches at the branch collar are usually the recommended type of cut. So we don't, it's called a heading cut, where we remove only part of a branch. This can leave a piece of the branch, and then a lot of times the limbs that grow, if we don't do this correctly, they grow off of there, aren't going to be as strong, and they sometimes look a little awkward. We do use heading cuts in some shrubs, but not as much for tree pruning. So in heading cuts, if you have like topping is a very severe example of heading cuts, where we don't cut off the entire branches, but they kind of cut down the branches. And I will tell you the first person, I don't know if I'll be the first person that says it, that you hear it, but topping is bad for trees. So we don't ever want to top trees. And that is because, again, like these heading cuts, they encourage vegetation growth below that cut, and it's not going to be as strong, and it's going to look very awkward, and usually leads to tree decline in death pretty shortly after that topping. Here's a look at proper pruning principles. So 3 cuts for removing a branch. So we first make this little notch on the underside of the branch that we're removing, and then we are going to cut from the top just above where we made that notch. And this is so when we get to the end of our cut, so when we get to here, that branch is going to be pretty heavy, and it's not going to have a whole lot of wood holding it onto the tree. So it's going to likely fall and break off. But when it breaks to this notch, then it should fall off pretty cleanly. If we didn't have this notch, when it fell and broke at this point, that bark oftentimes is very kind of stringy, and it would tear the bark off down the tree. And again, this is a larger wound to the tree than we would like. We want to avoid any larger wounds than we're already making. So then after you remove this branch, we usually do this out a little bit from the branch collar, and then we will come back and we will cut the rest of this part of the branch or stub off just at the branch collar. So this is where a lot of cells are that are going to grow and heal and close that wound pretty quickly. But we don't want to cut completely vertical with the tree. We want to leave that branch collar because all those cells are there that are going to heal that wound. So those are the three important cuts. Same thing on conifers. They actually have a little bit more pronounced branch collar than our deciduous trees usually, but kind of same thing. So cut the notch underneath, then cut the bulk of the branch off, and then come back and clean up that stub so it's at the branch collar. So, and then I have a couple of pictures just kind of giving indications, particularly if you're pruning the kind of first branches we want to start with. So here's an example of a sucker. So it is a branch that's kind of growing against the grain. So the rest of our branches have kind of come out very nicely. And this one is going kind of straight up through the rest of the foliage. This would be a good one to remove. Here's a stub. So if you have anything that broke off during the year and you're kind of coming back and cleaning up, here's a stub that we could remove using the same principles. Sprouts. So these would be some of those sprouts that come off the roots. So just some of the ones that we can start with. Here's one that has even more examples of things that are good to remove. So again, closely spaced branches, rubbing or overlapping branches. So in this case, I would either remove this branch here at the larger branch where it connects, or this one, but I would want to make it so they're not overlapping or rubbing each other. Sucker growth. So again, even as you get up further in the tree, you'll find kind of these, sometimes they come from an area like a wound we've had, but they'll just kind of be errant branches that grow at these odd angles and odd patterns. And those are ones we can remove. Any dead wood. So if you have branches that have had some dieback, coming in and removing all of that dead wood can prevent, again, disease spread and just improve the appearance of your tree. Some other ones are bunchy growth from old prunings. So if we've done a pruning incorrectly in the past, or someone else has pruned incorrectly and maybe didn't cut the whole branch, but did a header cut, we will have this kind of weird growth that comes from those pruning sites. So we can go back and instead of, again, just cutting off that bunchy growth, we would want to cut that off at the main stem of that branch. Some visual pictures of what you might see. So here's some water sprouts and some suckers. These take a lot of resources from your tree. So to prune them is a good, helps with those resources for the rest and for the bulk of the tree that we really want the appearance. Again, here's some more kind of, if we see this in the woods, we call it epicormic sprouting. Again, these two things can sometimes be indication of tree health and some long-term decline, but by removing them, it does kind of help prolong and remove those things that are, again, sucking resources. These sometimes also in forested environments, we'll call it epicormic sprouting. So sometimes if we open a forest up, the trees will form some epicormic sprouts like this, and that's usually just in response to having more sunlight on them. And then this down here is an example. So these are two branches that one of them should have been removed a long time ago, but this is the appearance now. So they have started, this branch has started to grow actually around this other branch. So if we had caught this tree, 20, 25 years prior, we should have removed this branch so this one could grow unhindered. Another thing to look for is, so where branches come together, that's called the crotch. And so in trees, it's actually better for them to have a wider angle to that crotch because it is stronger connection. In these like very V-shaped, this leaves a place for things like moisture to get in. And when we go through our freeze-thaw cycles, that can weaken the wood, and they actually split a lot easier. So if you're kind of looking at branches to remove, finding ones that perhaps have those weaker crotches, you can remove those as well. Pruning established trees. So I always put a note here that larger trees, if there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the crown, these can require a qualified tree care professional for pruning of those. But our common types of pruning for our established trees are going to be crown thinning, crown raising, crown reduction, and crown cleaning, which kind of, all of these are going to kind of help, particularly for safety, pulling out branches that perhaps are weaker or have already died, or we're just kind of trying to reduce the size of that crown so it still fits in the space that it's in. Branch pruning. So if we do decide we want to shorten a branch and not cut the whole limb off, we want to shorten that branch or twig and cut it back to a side branch about 1/4 inch above the bud that we want to cut closest to. And we always want to prune above a bud that's facing the outside of a plant. So this bud is going to become, right now it's a lateral bud, but when we prune off the terminal bud from this branch, this bud's going to now become kind of our terminal bud, and it is going to grow in this direction. So if we prune with the bud facing the inside of the plant, it is going to force its new growth into the tree in particular, which is not the way we want it to grow. So because then it'll rub over other branches most likely. We want it to grow to the outside. So if you are going to do a head cut, you want to make sure you do it that way. Pruning, again, those larger branches, make that, I jumped the gun and talked about it a little early, but make the first cut on the underside about 18 inches or so from the trunk, and then make that second cut further out on the branch, and then cut until your branch breaks free, and should be a very clean break to that. And then our third cut, again, is at that branch collar. As we saw through the branch, and then that 12 to 18 inches that you've left will fall off. And this should heal very quickly. It won't be necessarily the next growing season, but several growing seasons, and you should not be able to see that wound. It'll heal over. We don't recommend putting anything on that wound. So leaving it open is actually the best bet. So a lot of the tars and different paints that get put on, they will actually encourage like fungus growth and disease. So we just recommend leaving it open and letting nature do its thing. So it will heal usually just fine on its own. We do recommend the pruning during the winter, during the dormancy season for most trees. I have a couple examples of some other ones that we do different times of year, but if you're out particularly pruning, like oaks or other landscape trees in your yard, during the dormant season is the best, because you'll have that wound. It'll like harden over, so you'll still see obviously the wood that's underneath it, and it won't have peeled over completely, but it will form form its own version of a scab, and it'll do that during the dormant season. So we have less possibilities of insects making their way to that wound, and then oftentimes it's actually the insects that make their way to feed on that sap that has been exposed, and then they bring with them the diseases or fungus with them. So if we do this when they're not as active, we're less likely to avoid disease and insect damage. Again, late winter pruning leaves our fresh wounds exposed for only a short length of time before new growth begins in that wound sealing process. It is also a lot easier to make pruning decisions without leaves. So if you're, again, trying to maintain like that 1/3 or less, and you're trying to decide which branches, it is easier to see them. To avoid oak wilt, we do not prune from April to October. So this is when the little insects that carry oak wilt are active, and they will be attracted to wounds to oaks during this time. And so there's possibility of them, if we prune them and have that damage, being attracted to that. If we're pruning apple trees, including our flowering crabapples and hawthorns, this is a good time to prune them in late winter. So that'd be your January, February time period. There are some trees or shrubs that bloom early in the season, and we recommend pruning after they bloom. And this is so if we bloom, they already have their flower buds developed and waiting to break open in the spring. So if we don't want to miss out on flowers in the spring, we should let them bloom first and then prune after. So this includes, here's kind of a list of some natives and non-native landscaping shrubs that we find that are flowering. So same can be said for our native plums. And again, a lot of our flowering native shrubs as well fall into this category. So let them bloom first and prune after. Shrubs that are grown primarily for foliage rather than flowers can be pruned in spring before their growth begins. So that includes like sumac, smokebush, ninebark. Honeysuckle is on here. There are some native honeysuckles that we also can prune. Hedges and shrubs. So once a hedge reaches its desired height, prune the new growth back whenever it grows another 6 to 8 inches. And you want to prune within 2 inches of your last pruning. And most of our hedges can be pruned twice a year, so in the spring and then again in midsummer. So this is after, midsummer would be after the bulk of the growth, so you can kind of bring it back to that height that you wanted at. And then it'll have grown kind of the rest of the summer, and then doesn't usually grow any during the winter, but in the spring you can kind of clean it up again. We do want to prune hedges. So natives or ornamentals that we're using in hedges, we want to prune them so that they're wider at the base than at the top. And so this provides that they'll receive sunlight on all levels, and we won't have the legginess we find. So if we, and it's not uncommon to see them kind of pruned opposite of this, so like an upside down triangle, but all of that foliage at the top is going to prevent sunlight from reaching your bottom, and they'll instead put out like these really long leggy branches to compensate for that. So if we prune them just a little bit wider at the bottom and narrow as we go up, so kind of think about that triangle right side up, this will prevent that legginess. Rejuvenating older or overgrown shrubs, so things like forsythia, lilac, they will, as they age, they'll kind of start to be not as vigorous. However, they do like to put on new stems. So if we remove the oldest and thickest stems, this again kind of puts some of those resources back into the roots to be used to encourage new stems, and this can freshen up some of those overgrown or older shrubs that we have. So we can cut those back. So some can even be cut all the way back. So cut those canes back to the ground in early spring. So spirea, forsythia, the viburnums can be done this way. I keep honeysuckle in here because I like to think that we're all planting native honeysuckles these days, but the same can be done for them. Evergreens, our spruces, they actually do not grow continuously, but they can be pruned anytime because they have lateral or side buds that sprout if our terminal bud is removed. So you can prune them anytime, late winter is still a good time to prune those. On pines, we don't really recommend pruning. However, in the Christmas tree business, we do prune them to help maintain those Christmas tree shapes. And this happens, our pine pruning, particularly for Christmas tree growth, it all happens actually in July. And this happens because they will, one, you can shape them and they have a little bit of time to grow and heal those wounds. So if we're going to use them for Christmas trees, that coming Christmas or holiday season, they'll have healed over and they'll kind of be back without open wounds or places that haven't filled back in. But also it's very hot this time of year. So while we worry about insects and disease on some of our other deciduous species, that very hot weather tends to seal off these sappy trees quite quickly, which helps us again prevent disease. But generally speaking, pines in our landscape, we don't necessarily recommend pruning because they usually don't need it. Arborvitae, junipers, and yews, they do grow continuously throughout the growing season, and you can prune those anytime through middle of summer. Okay, I think I saw some questions, so I am gonna open the chat box and go through those. Smoke bush, that deer rubbed off most of the bark off the top half of the bush and broken several branches. So do you have any of your main branches left? So I would try to prune that so that you're leaving as much as you can for shrubbery for the next growing season. But if you can, particularly the broken branches, prune those back. The bark portion may, if it's on the main stem of the tree, it might be hard to prune so that you can remove the areas that have lost their bark, but you might be able to kind of let that heal itself and see how it goes. Okay. Yeah, Karen, it looks like I think I got all those. Marsha, when to prune peach? I prune mine about the same when I'm pruning other things around the yard. So usually during January, February is when I've been pruning my peach tree. And it has done well so far. Okay, top of main branch gone. Okay, yes, so I try to clean it up as much as possible without removing an excessive amount of it, because you do want it to have leaves for the next growing season. So that's what I'd say for the smoke bush. Okay, overgrown shrubs, rose of Sharon and American holly that I was planning to cut to the ground this winter. Will this work to give them a fresh start? So the rose of Sharon, it will probably, if you cut completely to the ground, I'm not sure it'll grow completely back, but you can kind of trim that back or prune it back to main stems, and it'll put branches off. And then American holly, I'll have to look that up. I'm not sure about our pruning recommendations for American holly. Good, Karen. I'm glad I clarified the information that you already had. Yes, see, we try to keep kind of going back to like the wounds and stuff. We try to keep, we don't want a lot of moisture to form underneath or around tree areas. This is why we mulch in like the donut shape. So we kind of keep the bulk of the mulch off from, being close to the stem. Same thing with like sealant or wrapping anything around trees, because this really fosters or holds in moisture, which can also then foster disease, and insects can live under there. So, and it's not pruning related, but it's a time of year if we have younger trees with thinner bark, such as maple, that we do recommend wrapping them just a little bit with tape because they are prone to like sun scald. So when we get to like late winter, they'll have gone in their dormancy. And then if they, the sun hits them, it gets warm during the day, those active cells start growing and kind of waking up. And then we go below freezing at night and it can cause damage to that area. And so a little bit of wrapping tape can help prevent that in the winter. So I recently looked at a property that they'd planted a bunch of dogwoods out in full sun and they had sun scald on pretty much all of their stems. Marcia, you also brought up a great point about keeping pruning tools clean. Yes, so this can be a big spreader of disease if we don't clean, especially for doing multiple trees in a row. We want to make sure we clean with a usually a very diluted bleach solution will do the trick. Oh, Karen, yeah. So yes, so it is good to do it during dormancy, just for that reason, to prevent them from having any disease make their way in. For oaks, a temperature cutoff for pruning in the winter. So there's not really a temperature cutoff. So usually our oaks will have, particularly January and February, even when we have those days that warm up above freezing, they aren't gonna kind of start to break their dormancy until we have some consistent nighttime temperatures above freezing. And so you're pretty safe to prune January, February, even if it is like, so if we get like one of those really, it seems like January or February, we get a really novel 65-degree day. Feel free to prune on those days. The insects will be a little bit active, but we usually fall below freezing within the next couple days, and that tree is still again in its dormancy. So usually okay to do those. Should I have treated that fungus growth? So we can treat, it depends what type of fungus it is. You could treat it. We do have some funguses fungi, I shouldn't say funguses, fungi that can be treated with some different chemicals, but we'd have to be able to identify what it was that was growing there before treating it. So, and particularly for apple, we also have horticulture specialists that might be able to give you a good idea of what it is. So you can always feel free to snap a picture. You can send it to me and I can pass it along to one of them. They're really great with the fruit trees in particular. Okay, yeah, if you have a picture, send it my way. Like I said, I'll pass that along as well if I don't recognize what it is. It seems like this summer we had a lot of interesting fungus growth in the woods, out of the woods. We had that really kind of wet spring and wet early summer, and it seemed very beneficial to a lot of the fungi on trees. We had a lot of interesting things. So maybe we can get you an answer if it needs treatment, or it might be something your tree heals on its own and it'll do okay. So, and the best thing we can do for trees, particularly if we are the ones planting them, is to give them like a really good start. So, planting correctly, keeping them from being planted too deep, and making sure that they, there's several foresters who really believe, and I am just about to do a Facebook post on this, is we've been really dry for the last several weeks. And even though our trees are in dormancy, the roots are still growing and they do still need water. And so sometimes it is necessary for us to water trees during the winter to help them kind of through their, to keep good tree health. Okay, cool. That's good. That's an older tree. Very good. Yeah, so sometimes those wet temperatures, high humidity, they really definitely foster fungal growth. So, and with fruit trees, I should also put, if you're planting fruit trees, I just went and saw some, a few weeks ago, and the trees had come with like a white plastic wrap, which was they left on to prevent like rabbit and deer damage. And the tree had kind of started to, it was increasing in size beyond those plastic wraps. And so just something to watch for. And underneath all that plastic was a lot of quite a few insects, and just it had kind of started to develop really wet conditions, which could lead to those fungal conditions. And so paying attention to what's on the tree and removing those in a timely manner. It's sometimes a quandary in Missouri because we're also fighting off rabbits and deer that cause damage to those young stems, but making sure that it's not causing damage to the tree is important. Are you planning to cut them down completely or prune them? So winter is a good time if you're doing eastern red cedar removal. It's a good time to do it just because it can be a lot of work to remove them. You can prune them during the winter as well. They're kind of fall in our pine category, so they don't necessarily, we don't prune them a lot. If you do, particularly most time when I've seen cedars pruned in yards, we'll do like the under, raising our crown so that we can fit things like lawnmowers or walk underneath them. Yeah, eastern red cedar, they're a mixed motion tree. So some people really like them and some do not like them. They do tend to grow in very, they like to grow in conditions that sometimes other trees don't like to grow in. And I think they can be quite aesthetically pleasing. They have a really pretty blueberry on the female ones during the winter, which is a nice bit of color. But yes, you can prune them through the winter. Same kind of protocol for pruning other trees. So if you prune the branch back and then hit that, knock that branch stub off at the root collar. Yeah, say eastern, they're not really an invasive species. They're actually native to Missouri. They just are they can be very prolific, which is I think where they get their bad rap. Oh, good. Thanks, Karen, for that. The berries for seasoning for grilled. Very good. Yeah, yes, cedar. It does smell really nice for burning in a campfire. Yes, agreed, Tabitha. So, and Marsha, I agree. They're also aggressive, and most of the time in Missouri, particularly with like natural resources managers, they get a lot of concern about cedars. So they do. Again, they grow a lot of places that other trees don't grow. So they'll be in their early succession species of trees. So if we let like a pasture go, the cedars tend to be one of those first species that make their way in there. And then they can be difficult to remove. The other place where natural resource managers get irritated by them is on glades. So historically, our glades were maintained by fire, and we've taken a lot of fire out of our landscape. Of course, to save, human infrastructure and humans in general. And so a lot of our glade management, requires the removal of cedars. Yes, I know several people, Karen, that will have used them for Christmas trees, but they are a little prickly and sometimes messy. So, and that's a great advertisement for next week's Lunch and Learn. So we're going to talk about Christmas trees, a little bit about the Christmas tree industry, in Missouri. So we have quite a few Christmas tree farms in the state of Missouri. So we're going to talk about those next week. But yes, cedars do make a fabulous Christmas. I like to decorate. We have a couple cedars outside that I like to decorate outside. So I'll use shatterproof ornaments on them and decorate them just a little. Yes, yep. So there's nothing quite like a real Christmas tree for the holidays. And I should put a plug here, if anybody is in the Columbia area, the University of Missouri in Columbia, so the students at Mizzou, the Forestry Club, they will sell Christmas trees the 10th and 11th of December. So if you're in that area, I put a plug in for campus today. So the last time I heard, they usually sell them at the stadium. They used to have the Forest Club used to have their own Christmas tree farm, which is where I got a lot of experience growing Christmas trees, but they've since sold off the farm that had the Christmas trees at it. So they now purchase wholesale and resell. But yes, they should be there. I think they also make wreaths as well. So maybe if you're not on the market for a Christmas tree, but looking for a wreath, they have those as well. All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing. And I think I've answered all the questions today. Anything else before we go? Hope everyone has a great Thanksgiving holiday. And I will see you back here next Tuesday, which is November 30th. So the last day of the month. I will also have new registration for December Lunch and Learns and hopefully some new great topics to cover. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.